Thank you all for joining us for the Planning Lessons Engagement Workshop. Joining us today is Megan Madriaga Hopkins from the College of Engineering. She will be reviewing the basics of planning your class time with students to be organized, engaging, and productive. So I'm going to hand it over to her to get us started.
Thanks, Savannah. Thank you everyone for coming. We have such a big group, so I don't know that we have time to do intros for everyone. I'll give you a brief intro about me, just so you know a little bit about my background. And then if you have any questions, I've got the chat open as well. I've been teaching for about over 20 years. I've worked at the middle school, high school, community college, as well as university level. And I've been with UNLV for a little over 5 years. And my background is in curriculum and instruction. I currently work for the College of Engineering. I teach international students there, and I also am their technical writer. So that's a little bit of my background. We're gonna go through some things, and as we go through today, I have some sections where we're going to be stopping to brainstorm. And again, since we're such a large group, I'll ask if anyone wants to share. Maybe we can take 2 or 3 people to share your ideas each time, so that we can get through the workshop within our allocated time. So I'm gonna go ahead and start. Does anyone have any questions for me before I start the workshop? All right. If you do anytime throughout have questions, please put them in the chat, and either Navenna or I can answer them as we go through. So. All right. Oops. We'll go to the overview of the workshop. So we're going to start with a little bit of a warm-up, where we'll do a little bit of brainstorming and talking about what you do now. And then we'll review these next points. I'll let you take a minute to look over them. Also, I think this workshop will be shared with you. So feel free to take notes, but you will also have access to it later on, so you don't have to write down everything. Okay, so the first point is the warm-up. So I'd like you all to think about what you're doing now. Why is lesson planning important? Your current methods of lesson planning, and if you feel like these are effective for you or not. All right, would anyone like to share why they think lesson planning is important?
Hello. So I am not currently teaching any classes, which is why I don't feel like I have a ton to say, but I do know that lesson planning is important, because if you don't have a plan, then you might not get to everything you need, or you might just kind of end up wandering aimlessly and then not get the objective across by the end.
Good.
So that's why
yes.
it's important.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So key step 1 is setting your objectives of the lesson, right? And one lesson doesn't necessarily mean one class. You may have a lesson that takes a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Things you want to keep in mind are your ULOs and your course objectives. It's really important that you know why you're teaching what you're teaching. You usually do, but I think it's also really important to convey this to your students so they know, why are they learning this? Why is this important to them? And it can give them buy-in. You can include these objectives on a slide in your presentation at the beginning so that you don't forget to go over them, if that helps you. Okay. The second point is that first impressions are important. And that meaning just, you want to start class at the beginning of class time. Oftentimes we get distracted with, housekeeping duties. We got to pass back papers and we need to take attendance, but you don't want to wait 5 or 10 minutes and do this at the beginning of class, because then students get used to that, right? And then they start rolling in later and later. They're not on focus. So if you can get students started doing something right at the beginning, then you can do all that other, like, as I said, housekeeping activities while they're doing that. And there are many ways to do this. I will go through some of them. So here's some different ways that you can start a class with an anticipatory set. Just something that can get your students on focus for your class, right? They just left their world, their life, a different class, so they're focusing now on your class. So you might have a visual or a point to consider or an equation or something up right when they walk into the classroom, or if they're in a virtual class, right when they get there, so that they're on task and on target right at the beginning. Another way to do this is through review. You can put up a review question. If you want to have them focus doing other things, you can have them write down some review things, equations, a little bit of a review what you did the last lesson. Also, you can put up the course objectives, right? And we always want to be keeping in mind, like, students' lives, real world. How does what they're doing in your class connect to the real world? Because that's what's going to make it important to them. And you can be creative when you do this. There's lots of different ways to do it. Visuals are great, videos are great. The third point is you want to make sure that when you're presenting information, it's effective for students. Remember that our students have really short attention spans. 15 minutes is probably a maximum, since, you know, we live in this digital world and, you know, they're used to scrolling through their life like we all are. So you want to have a variety of activities planned throughout the class so that the students stay engaged. Also, you want to think about what's the basic information that my students need, and then what's the supplementary information. So if you can start and give them that basic information first, sort of as a scaffolding, then you can fill in later, you know, with the additional information. That way, they're understanding the basics before they get the details and before they get any exceptions. Okay. So to present the information efficiently, you got to take a step back and think, okay, what's the simplest and clearest form I can present? Try to choose vocabulary students already know. If there's new vocabulary, then you need to spend that time to define it. Make sure they understand it. If you're using words that students don't know, they're going to tune out. Visuals are great because then they're focusing on that, right? And we live in such a visual world anymore that students are used to that. They want that. If you're giving a process, you want to demonstrate it. You want to model. Make sure your models are clear and accurate. Just because you explain it doesn't mean they're going to understand it, right? So anytime you can have visual support, that's going to really help them. And remember that you want to teach to both halves of the brain, right? So words are important. Body language is also important. Right now, if you're teaching digitally, the body language is hard. It's hard for me right now, I know, because I'm a very hands-on, hand-moving person. So think of what visuals you can have to help engage them in their understanding. Okay. You want to try to increase your students' motivation, right? Because we want them to be intrinsically motivated. We want them to be taking our class for more than just the grade. So there's different ways to do that, and we'll talk a little bit about those. Level of concern is important to consider. How much do students care? If the students can't relate the work to their current life or the job that they want to have, then they're gonna not care as much, right? You want a moderate level of concern. If they don't care, they're not gonna learn. But if they're stressed out, if they care too much, if it's too intense, then they're also not gonna learn. Also, pay attention to the feeling or tone you create in your classroom. When students feel like they're going to be successful, then they're going to try harder. So you can do this by setting the feeling of tone in the class, right? So different ways you can do this is, take some time at the beginning of a course to let students get to know each other so that they feel comfortable with each other, assign partner projects, group projects, even if they're not high stakes projects, it gives the students an opportunity to kind of build a community in your classroom, and then they're going to feel more comfortable. Also, the way you interact with the students will affect the feeling or tone. So having, kind of an open door policy, friendly, so that they feel comfortable in your class will really help. Also, for students to be successful, they have to achieve, right? So sometimes you're teaching a class that's really challenging, but the students have to be able to feel like they can be successful in that class. So you can moderate the level of difficulty, right? So, building blocks to get them to where they need to go. If it's really easy for them, they're not going to pay attention. If it's too hard, they'll feel like I can't do this. So how do you know if it's too easy or too hard? Something you can do is, pre-assessments. Before you start a unit, you might have a little pre-quiz to find out what the students already know about this, right? So that you're not teaching stuff they already know. Oftentimes, we assume students know more than they do. So this is also a good eye opener for you to know exactly where the students are. I would say a pre-test just at the beginning of the semester may not be enough. You want to gauge them as you're going, right? Did they learn this first chunk of material? Are we ready to move on to the next? Because you want them to be successful. All right. So interest is another way to create student motivation. So connecting things to their lives and to the real world. There's a lot of different methods we could use. So I'd like to take a minute here and see if any of you would like to share some of the methods you use in your classrooms or that you've had in classes you've been in that were effective to engage the students. So please feel free to turn on your mic and share if you have something.
This is Brian. I just wanted to say for me, what works really well is when they can see you as human, and then you don't make everything a pass, like they have to be graded. Like, let's do some fun things.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Did anyone else like to share? Okay, we'll move on to the next section. Students also need to know how they're doing in a class. So that means we need to be giving consistent feedback throughout the class, right? So when they're participating in the class, checking in with them, seeing how they're doing, giving them feedback. It's harder when we're in a virtual situation. If you're in person, you can walk the room and you can look at what they're doing and just even like, oh, that looks nice, or, oh, good job with that. It means so much to those students that you're taking the time to pay attention to what they're doing. In a virtual world, if they're submitting things online, you need to take the time to give them that feedback. If they don't get feedback for a week or 2 weeks, then they'll start getting more stressed and the stress level rises, right? They don't know, did I do it right? Did I not do it right? So keep that in mind, that feedback should be ongoing and it should be often. Quizzes, short written responses, it can be a sentence or a 2-question quiz, a multiple choice quiz that you can put really easy into Canvas just to check how they're doing. If students do a written response, reply to that written response, even if it's just a couple of words. If you're doing this in class, if you're asking questions and students are giving answers in class, this is a great way to see who understands. And you want to call on a variety of people to see that, you know, not just the overachiever, superachiever is understanding what's going on. Because students have the two types of motivation, right? They have intrinsic, which is what we want, and extrinsic, which is just their final grade or getting the job they want. But the more we can increase their motivation, the more we can put it inside and make them care about the class, the better they're going to do in that class. Does anyone have any other comments or questions on student motivation before we move on to the next section?
Hi, Megan. This is Rubab.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question. So this intrinsic, which is like learning and satisfaction, how do we actually formalize it in lesson planning? Because I feel like most of as a student and as the one on the receiving end, right from the beginning, if I have to be a little bit frank over here, right from the beginning, we are being told about our grade distribution and how the lesson planning would be there and everything. And while this is a useful piece of information, it creates a sense of fear if the class is a little challenging and our learning and satisfaction quite just it's kind of like replaced by that fear. So how do we address that in a class setting?
So I think that, you know, it's kind of the feeling you set up in the class, right? That students know it's okay to make mistakes and that they're going to get feedback that's going to help them to learn. Connecting material to things that are relevant to their life, which this just makes us really take a step back and think, okay, what am I teaching my students and how is that going to be something they can use in their life, or how does it affect their worldview? Then it makes the material relevant to them. Going over the objectives every day, letting them know this is what we're learning, this is why we're learning it, can add to that motivation. And then the feedback, I think, you know, taking the time to give them feedback and let them know that they're successful, because we all know, like, when we're successful, we feel good about ourselves, right? So if we have opportunities to be successful in the class regularly, not just on a monthly quiz or on the midterm exam, we're going to feel better about it. And I can't remember who it was it Brian that mentioned, you know, doing activities in the class that aren't for a grade, just to engage the students together. That's also another really good way to build intrinsic motivation.
Okay. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments about that? Okay, we'll go to our next slide then. All right, so point number 4, we're on 4 out of 7. And I've mentioned this numerous times already, but making it meaningful. So we need to know what the students already know, what's their past knowledge, right? And then they have their present learning and how that's going to connect to their future situation. So at the beginning of each unit, finding out what they already know about the topic, and then you can connect, you know, the new information to what they already know. And then using experiences that students have. So this will make you engage the students. You know, ask them questions. Have you ever experienced this? How do you think you would use this? How is this relevant in your life? And then when they share, listen to them. So that way, you know their experience and how they feel about things. Also, you want to make sure that you're really identifying the most important information that the students need to get, the critical part. There's so much information sometimes, but let them know, hey, this is really important, this is key, and we're going to be building off this. So let's get this down, and then we'll move to the next section. Labeling that new learning, and then anytime there's exceptions, present them last, right? I'm sure you've all had classes. I remember a class I had way back when I was at university with this amazingly overzealous math teacher who would tell us all the equations and then give us all the exceptions. And in my brain that has a hard time processing math, I would mix in 3 different types of doing the equation, and my equations would be completely wrong. So, be aware that give them core information before you show any exceptions or any other ways to do things differently, because you understand the material you're teaching very well. That doesn't necessarily mean that the students will, or that all students have the same way of processing that you do. And so it's important to be aware of that. Okay, we'll move on to checking for understanding. So there's a lot of different ways to check for understanding. It doesn't need to be a formal assessment, a quiz, or an essay or anything like that. There's a lot of different things that you can do. When you're lecturing, a lot of times we just, we have so much we have to cover, and we're like, you say part of your lecture and then you're, okay, does everyone understand? Does anyone have a question? And no one's gonna ask a question, right? They're nervous. They don't know if their question is the right question. So different ways you can do this is using signaled answers, where students can do like a hand gesture. You can say yes or no, is this true? Is this not true? And then tell them something and see if they understand it, or it's true, it's not true. Don't give them all true answers, right? So they actually have to think. You can do true and false questions, right? And you can say, okay, number 1 is true, number 2 is false, and have the students show you, agree, disagree. Multiple choice, again, they can do this with hand gestures. So different ways where you're getting everyone to participate, not just the students that know the answers that are going to share the answers. You want to check in with everybody to make sure they're getting it. Individual responses, if you have a good rapport with your class, or there's some students that really like to share out, is another way you can do this. So you can call on students to summarize the lesson or explain a concept to the group. It's okay if you just explained it. Our brains need to hear things several times to really process them. So having it explained by another student, you could also have them, in a group, discuss it. I know doing things online right now, it's a little bit harder and with social distancing, but you could have them all write down their ideas to give everyone time to process, take 3 minutes to summarize what we just went over, and then call on students to share their summaries. That kind of lowers stress level because they've had time to think and process and write. So just checking in throughout the lesson is a good way to make sure students are understanding. Exit tickets, I really like too, where students have to write something and give it to you for the end. That way, when you leave the class, you can read through those and you can find out if they understood or if they didn't understand, and if you need to review. You can use these at the beginning of class, right, as kind of sponge activities to take the time when you're doing administrative things, have a little mini quiz up to review the lessons from the past class. Or you can do it at the end. If you want to do your housekeeping tasks at the end, you can have a little, have them write their summaries and have a short 3 or 4 minute discussion where students can share their ideas of what they've learned that day. Okay. So we're now to slide number 6, designing effective practice. In this area, you want to be thinking about the quantity and the quality of the homework you're assigning. You want to give meaningful amounts of practice, not overwhelming amounts of practice. So you really want to think about, okay, what's necessary for the students to understand the material that we did today? Do they need to do 20 problems to practice, or is 8 or 9 enough? If it's something new that they're learning, then you want to give intense practice. But don't forget about older learning, things that they've learned in the past section or the past unit, you might include some of those ideas to review in their homework assignments also. Also make sure you're giving feedback on the practice. So if you're assigning homework, you have to grade it, right? It can't be 2 or 3 or 4 weeks later that they get feedback on their homework, because that's not useful to them. So then that might help you think, okay, how much do I have time to grade? How much do they need to know that I can grade effectively? So we're presenting chunks at a time, right? And then assessing, do they understand that chunk? And then go to the next chunk. And then do they understand that chunk? Anytime you give an assignment to students, you need to show them how to do it, right? So if it's whatever it is, you should probably do it in class with them before you assign them to do it outside of class, so that they clearly know what they're supposed to be doing. There's no worse feeling than when you get an assignment and you have no idea where to start. Your stress level rises and you're not going to be successful because you're overstressed. So modeling is so important before you give students new information or things to do outside of class. And then in the digital age that we're in right now, you know, maybe when you're explaining it, think about step-by-step instructions. And in the assignment, make sure you have really clear step-by-step instructions for the students. Even if you've modeled it in class, when they're outside of class, they might not remember that. And so they need to know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Okay. Any questions before we move on to step 7? Okay. Step 7 is sort of where we want to watch our students' brains grow, right? We want to extend their thinking. So all of the work we give them shouldn't just be knowledge-based. You know, they are not the vessels to be filled, right? And we're filling their vessel. No, that's the first step. They need the knowledge, but then do they understand, right? So we've talked about that, you know, checking with them, checking in regularly, making sure they understand. So once you've given them the information and you know they understand it, the next step is to make them apply that knowledge. So give them a new situation in which they can use what they've been taught. This involves convergence thinking, right? They have to put ideas together. And this is going to help them remember. Analysis is the next step. So organizing the information and reorganizing it in a different way, putting things into categories. This is what we've learned. This is not what we've learned, right? Synthesis, when they have to create something new using what you've taught them. And then evaluation, where they have to judge what they've learned. Either they have to self-evaluate, or they might be evaluating group projects or projects of other students. So you want to extend the thinking, make them think, right? Trust them to know that you believe in them, that they can think, right? They don't just need to gain knowledge. They need to go through all of these steps to really process information. Any questions or comments here? On to final points here. Things that you want to keep in mind throughout your lessons. Dignifying student errors is so important. If students are embarrassed to make a mistake, they're not going to let you know what they understand and what they don't understand. So when you ask a student a question, if they don't give you the right answer, we don't want to say, sorry, that's wrong, right? Because then the student's going to feel horrible and they're not going to want to participate the next time. So thinking of ways that you can dignify their answer to make them not feel bad, to feel good about sharing, and then grow from there. So things you can say is, that's a good start. I see your thinking. That's the first step. Okay, so how can we move on, right? And then you want to prompt the correct answer. Asking, okay, that's a good start. Who can build on what Steve said? and go from there, right? Or can anyone elaborate on Melissa's ideas, right? So you're not shutting them down, you're making them a starting point and then letting other students build off of it. That also helps create that sense of community in your classroom. But also you want to hold them accountable, right? So if you're getting a lot of incorrect answers, then you might need to take a step back because students aren't getting it, right? So, okay, so it seems there's some, not everyone's not clear on exactly what we went over. So I'm going to go back and we're going to do a review. Write down what you know, and then who wants to explain, right? And then, review it again. Another point we've already talked about is not wasting class time. So sponge activities, right? When you're doing administrative stuff. So at either the beginning of class or the end of class, you can do review questions, practice, apply concepts. When I'm teaching, I often, once students are busy doing stuff and they're on task, that's when I try to do administrative stuff. But sometimes we have to do it at the beginning or the end, but always try to keep them engaged so that you're not wasting the precious little time that you have them. We have some more points to keep in mind. You want to teach so that your students will remember. So you're working hard, you're creating lesson plans, you're being very diligent about presenting the material, but you want them to remember. So make those connections. How can students connect what you're learning to what they've learned previously so they can grow their brain, or they can connect it to real life experiences, things that matter to them, that are valuable to them. To do this, you might find out, are they involved in any clubs? What sort of extracurricular activities do they like? What are their hobbies? Then when you're giving examples, you can tie examples in to things that the students are actually interested in. Or you can even ask them, how would you apply this to something you're interested in your life, and share that with the group? People like to talk about themselves. So if they can figure out a way that it connects to them, they're going to buy in more. Creating that pleasant tone in the classroom. Everyone has different personalities, so you'll have different ways of doing that. But you want the students to feel comfortable with you and with each other. And I think sometimes we think, I have so much material to cover, I don't have time to do community building at the beginning. But in my experience, when you take maybe one day or 10 minutes of class for the first 2 weeks to do community building, the rest of the semester is so much better because the students are happy to be there. They have friends in the class. They're comfortable there, and they put out more effort in the class. You want to work to achieve a high degree of original learning, right? So again, that means we're going back to knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation. Keep those ideas in mind as you progress through the lesson so that students can apply all those levels of knowledge. And then schedule in practice. So once you've finished a unit, maybe in the next unit, have them do a little bit of review in some of the homework, or maybe have some review for sponge activities so that they don't forget what they've learned previously and that they know they're building on that. Okay. You want to teach to promote transfer, right? So past learning is influencing new learning. So if an easy way you can do this, and this helps everyone in a classroom, is try to present things in a similar way. Humans like patterns. We like repetition. We like to know what's expected of us, what's first, what's second, what's third. So if you consistently present material in a certain way, your students will be prepared. Their brains will be prepared. You want to associate like what they're doing in class to their interests, right? And then they're going to achieve better. Make sure that they're really learning, that the key basic concepts are presented first. Make sure they understand the key basic concepts first before we add in supplemental things or exceptions to rules, and that they understand the critical aspects of what you're teaching. Like, how is this different than this? Make sure they understand. Can they compare? Can they contrast? So that they're really understanding the material. And now we're on to our summary and review. So lesson objectives are important. You know your lesson objectives. Your students should also know the lesson objectives. They should know why they're doing what they're doing in your classroom. What's the purpose? Make sure you're using your time effectively. Don't waste the precious moments you have with your students. Make sure there's a purpose behind your lessons. I'm sure there is, and I'm sure you know the purpose, but it's also good to convey that to your students to get buy-in. They know the purpose, they're going to be more focused, right? Keep their interests and experiences in mind. That means you need to find out a little bit about their interests and experiences, right? In the first or second week, or even now if you're teaching, you can have a little assignment to throw in to find out what their interests are. Extend their thinking, knowledge comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, evaluation. Dignify their questions. Don't make them afraid to ask questions, right? There's never a wrong answer. It's just a building block for the right answer, right? And then working towards transfer so they can transfer this knowledge and apply it in other situations. And then, of course, once you do all that, you're going to be awesome.